Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. This episode is another episode on early Christian literary history, this time with a particular focus on the non-canonical, so the texts, the documents that were written at the time, but didn't make it into the New Testament as we know it. My guest for this is really fantastic, Eric Vanden Eykel. Eric is an Associate Professor of Religious Studies at Durham College and the author of But Their Faces Were All Looking Up, author and reader in the Proto-Evangelium of James, The Magi, Who They Were, How They've Been Remembered, and Why They Still Fascinate, and an edited volume titled Sex, Violence, and Early Christian Texts. This episode will be available both in the usual audio podcast format, and I'm also going to make a video version of it. You might be watching it right now, available on YouTube, so if you want, you can see us having the conversation. I don't think it really matters, but the reason I'm doing that is I've noticed the religious history ones tend to be by far and away the most popular and get the most views and engagement on YouTube. So for the religious history ones, I'll make a YouTube version of them available. Give me feedback on that. I'm just trying to make the content fit where the audience is at and make it, easiest for people to find, essentially. So yeah, if you want to watch this on YouTube, just head over to the channel there. And I'll also mention, actually, I have been developing for over a year now a YouTube history series on this sort of period and bits of history that won't be ready till next year. It's been a huge project, but just put a placeholder. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel so that you're there when that comes out, because, well, more to follow on that shortly. Final thing is just, as always, if you enjoy this show, please do consider supporting it. I do not do any advertisements or have any sponsorships, so all the costs associated with this are just covered by listeners chipping in what they can. I don't know about you, but I personally really love big, long, fun, in-depth, engaged conversations like this. And this is definitely one of those. It's hopefully still accessible, but we really get into the weeds of, what's going on in the first couple of centuries of Christianity, which, as you know, I've been super interested in recently. I love that. I love doing it. I love bringing it to you. I love other people doing it and me watching them. And I do find it kind of spoils it for the content where they interrupt it every 20 minutes to sell you a subscription to a VPN or male baldness pills or something like that. So I don't do that. I think it's much nicer to be able to just sit down and just soak it all in. So what I do instead is every now and again I say, before we get going, it would genuinely mean a lot if you would consider supporting this. It's totally up to you. This is very much suggested donation, how much you do. I've been suggesting if you can chip in $2 an episode, that would be amazing. Price of a cup of coffee, probably a little less now with prices going up, but something like that, or whatever seems right to you. And if you'd like to do that, the website for it is patreon.com/political philosophy podcast, patreon.com/political philosophy podcast. The links to that and everything else are on the website, politicalphilosophypodcast.com. And yeah, if you're already doing that, thank you so much for doing it. You're genuinely making the show possible, and you're awesome. Cheers. Okay. Let's get to it then. This is Non-Canonical Christian Texts with Eric Vanden Eykel. Okay. I am joined today by Professor Eric Vanden Eykel. Eric, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So Briefly, what's sort of your area? What are the things you like to read and write and teach and think about?
Oh, yeah. So I am a one-person department here. I'm a associate professor at Ferrum College, and I teach the religious studies department. And so as a one-person department, I kind of teach a little bit of everything. I teach a class on world religions and classes on Old Testament, New Testament, early Christian literature, right now archaeology. So I teach a little bit of everything, anything that you would expect to find in a religious studies classroom at a college. And as far as my research and writing, my specialty is non-canonical Christian literature, so stuff that was written after the New Testament. And I also do a lot with anti-Judaism, anti-Jewish violence, and then sexual violence as well. And those things kind of have been keeping me busy for the last few years.
I asked you want to do non-canonical because I've spent quite a bit of time with like canonical and the synoptic problem and so on, and I haven't wrapped my head around this side of things at all. And I thought if you assisted me in doing so, it might be interesting for the audience.
Mm-hmm.
To start with, how do you even start here? Because, like, even limiting ourselves, there's a quite open question of what's the cutoff point here. But even limiting ourselves to the first few centuries of Christianity, I feel like you've got hypothetical documents, you've got documents that are attested but not known, you've got church fathers, you've got non-canonical gospels, you've got sayings lists like Thomas, you've got more letters that didn't make the cut. With the canon, I've at least got like Gospels and Acts, letters, Revelations tacked on at the end. An Old Testament in the Jewish organization, you have like Torah, prophets, major and minor, writings.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts about how to even begin to think about the space of non-canonical Christian, not non-canonical sort of intertestament stuff, but all the various infancy gospels and stuff, like how to even start thinking about that space?
Oh, yeah. When we figure out a good solution
Take as
to
long
that,
as you want with this one.
Yeah, yeah. This is a big question. So, I mean, so thinking just in terms of early Christian literature, one of the, I mean, one of the a good starting point is to kind of acknowledge that all of the categories that we have drawn for these things and all of these boxes that we've made to put them in, they are useful categories. Categories need to be useful, but they're also artificial. And so, when we're talking about, what's the difference between a non-canonical Christian text and a canonical Christian text? Now, the sort of churchy answer, which I don't say pejoratively, but just to sort of acknowledge that that's a perspective. The kind of churchy answer is, well, the New Testament texts are different because they're inspired or they're, whatever. God wanted those to be there. Okay. And then presumably the non-canonical stuff isn't. That's really only so helpful because how do you go about assessing that claim or defending it, really? And so as a starting point, I like to kind of take all of those categories and say all of these things are ways that we make sense of of the stuff that we're trying to make sense of. But if we take all these categories out, what we're left with is early Christian literature. And I think that's a helpful starting point to say, when we look at the literature, the literary activity of early Christian authors, what we're seeing is a huge amount of diversity, right? That's very contrary to the story that some of us were taught growing up, where we have a kind of univocal view of things, which is in the New Testament, and then you have the deviant view of things, which is in the non-canonical stuff. So taking that category away, or taking all of those categories away and just saying what we have is early Christian literature, slightly later Christian literature, even later Christian literature, but all of this stuff is part of the same literary pool. And if we do that, I think that's a helpful starting point, because it kind of it reminds us that what we're dealing with is not just one winning group or one kind of mainstream group and then all of these other smaller groups. What we're dealing with is early Christianity is a diverse phenomenon. And the literature of early Christianity reflects that. So and interrupt me at any time if you have a follow-up, because I'll just keep going otherwise. But
no, I will definitely let you know when I have thoughts, but continue, please.
Please. And so when we're looking at, let's say, the New Testament itself and the genres that you listed of gospel and history, epistle, and apocalypse, all of these, those genres also kind of help us to understand the types of things that we're dealing with other early Christian literature. So we have gospels that are classified as canonical, and then we have gospels that are classified as uncanonical or non-canonical. We have a canonical history, Acts, and then we have lots of non-canonical Acts as well. We have apocryphal letters, and we have plenty of apocryphal apocalypses. And so, I think, and that just kind of circling back, that really, I think, supports this the starting point of just kind of getting rid of all of the non-canonical and canonical barriers, and just saying, when we look at the literature of early Christianity, what do we have? And then maybe a related question to that is, okay, so the category of canonical, because some of your listeners right now are saying, wait a second, he's saying that the New Testament doesn't exist. No, it actually does. But that's also part of the literary trajectory of early Christianity, is saying we have all of this literature, and at some point, and it's a complicated process, but at some point, these 27 books kind of coalesce into, well, these ones are different than these ones. But that comes later. And at the very beginning, we just kind of, it's not necessarily a free-for-all, but at the very beginning, we just have the literary pool.
Yeah, and it's like the person who was writing Luke, say, and the person who was writing, what's your one? The Evangelium of James? How do you say that one?
Yeah, the Proto-Evangelium, or just Proto-Gospel is, yeah.
I'm going to go with Proto-Gospel. The person who was writing the Proto-Gospel of James and the person who was writing Luke did not know that one would be put together with another list of books, some of which presumably weren't even written at the time of Luke, and packaged as a thing we call the Bible, and the other did not know that they would be kind of put off to the side and referred to as unofficial or unorthodox or Gnostic or what have you. That wasn't something that they were aware of at the time. That's something that we impose looking back.
Absolutely. And I think, especially it's especially true with New Testament texts, which are late first century, early second century. We don't need to get into the dating of Luke and Acts right now, but late first century, early second century. And
we can if you want. This is something I've spent time on.
This is a safe place. We can get into the dating. No, I think, I tend to, for the vast majority of biblical scholars, I would say out there, most of us were kind of trained to read Luke as a late first century text, and also Acts is written by the same author probably. But there's more of a movement lately to push Luke and also perhaps other of the Gospels into the early second century as well. But regardless of where exactly you date Luke and Acts, this author does not see themselves as writing. None of the New Testament authors see themselves as writing the New Testament, right? They're not. None of them are sitting down in a group text and saying, "Okay, wait, are you working on a gospel here or whatever?" None of them are seeing themselves as writing scripture, as writing the New Testament. When you get into something like the Proto-Gospel of James, and I'll just kind of introduce that briefly as, the Proto-Gospel of James is in the history of Christian thought, or in the history of Christian narrative, probably one of the most influential texts that many people have never heard of. If you've ever been to a church, in a Catholic church or an Orthodox church, you have seen evidence of the Proto-Gospel of James, even though most people who are going to that church have never read it. But it's a really, really interesting life of Mary. And so it includes stories about Mary's parents and Mary's birth and her childhood, pregnancy with Jesus, marriage to Joseph, all of that. it's a late 2nd century text that's wildly influential, really has a huge impact on other literature that follows, iconography, these sorts of things. And so that author, the author of the Proto-Gospel of James, is also probably doesn't see themselves as writing anything that would be identified as a New Testament, because we don't have a New Testament until, the 4th century, or the 4th century, late 4th century at the earliest, really. But the Proto-Gospel of James author doesn't see themselves as writing part of the New Testament, but they do see themselves as filling out the story that they're finding in Matthew, in Luke, maybe Mark, but maybe not, and then also John. And they see themselves as, as providing the parts of those stories that they see as missing, right? Like, this story, it doesn't address a lot of stuff. So they do see themselves, I think, as writing a kind of supplement, but in terms of something that would be included in the Bible or the New Testament or whatever, if this person got a note in the mail one day that says, "We really appreciate your piece, but we're not going to include it in the New Testament," that person would be like, "What in the world are you talking about? I just wrote this thing, right?
What is the New Testament?
What is the New Testament, right? What even is it?" And so, while the New Testament authors don't see themselves as writing with any kind of collection in mind, I don't think the Proto-Gospel author does either. But with the Proto-Gospel, what you get is a kind of movement towards, this author might not see themselves as writing with inclusion in a collection in mind, but the author is writing this text in relation to these other texts. And so there in the 2nd century, you kind of see the very, very beginnings of that kind of coalescing into a canon.
Yeah, you do see, like, in response to I don't know, maybe something like Marcion or something, like a sort of thought of, like, there's not a canon, but there's maybe, like, more authoritative and less authoritative texts.
Yeah.
You're beginning to get the sense of, like, these are the ones we value. But let's rewind and get back to
Sure.
there. I want to do this chronologically, because I don't know about you. You'll have spent just, like, infinitely more time with this than me. For me, getting just the chronology of texts with all of the provisos that we actually just don't know, and this is very complicated and so on. But, like, the authentic Paul comes first, then Mark, then probably Matthew, Luke, John, right? Was just so useful for me in wrapping my head around what was going on. So starting at the beginning, do you have any informed speculation of what else was out there? And presumably, correct me, none of it survived at the time of, say, the writing of Mark. We presumably have other letters of Paul because he mentioned them. But do you have any sense of, like, were other people writing letters? Were Peter or James writing letters? Were there other Gospels prior to Mark, or was he really, like, the first one to do it? And the answer may well be we just don't know. But is there any speculation or any shading in the probabilities there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love some good informed speculation. So if we start with the question of Paul, and I'm a Gospels person first and foremost, and so my knowledge of Paul is just good enough to get me in trouble. But that's a good starting point, though. If we start with something like Paul, and yes, absolutely. So we have we divide Paul's letters, as you suggested, into kind of two camps. We divide Paul's letters into authentic Paul and then inauthentic Paul. And inauthentic Paul is definitely the pastoral epistles, so 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus, maybe Ephesians and Colossians, although the jury's still out, and maybe 2nd Thessalonians. And everything else, unless I'm missing one, everything else sort of falls into we're pretty sure that Paul wrote this. So are there other letters out there? Absolutely. 100%, I would say, informed speculating. I would say 100% other early Christian teachers are writing letters. And the reason I say absolutely is, we get we get stories about Paul in Acts, and one of the really interesting things about Paul in Acts is that Paul in Acts doesn't write letters.
Yeah.
So Paul in Acts is traveling around. He's a traveling missionary. He's teaching, and letters for Paul. Obviously, I don't know how Paul felt about his own letters, but letters for Paul seem to have been almost what we could classify as a necessary evil, right? Paul says throughout his letters, I wish I could be there with you. And so it seems like then if you have, Paul is a traveling missionary or traveling, preacher or guru, we could call him perhaps. And then he's writing letters to the communities that he's left behind or hopes to visit again in the future. Okay, so that sort of gives us this image of what that kind of job, if we called it that, would look like. But then, I mean, Paul in Galatians talks about other people who are traveling around doing the same thing. And so, Paul,
and he's not always super happy with them.
Well, he's almost never super happy with them, right? He's like, I can't believe
he's not a very happy guy overall.
No, I mean, in Galatians, he says, I wish that they would castrate themselves, right? And it's like, so and that's one of those things like, when we talk about, does Paul know that he was writing, something that would be read devotionally by people for 2,000 years? I mean, in my mind, nobody writes Galatians thinking that other people are going to read that, right?
Which is the one where he's like, he loses track of who he baptized and didn't, and just mid-sentence just forgets what he's talking about.
First Corinthians, he's like, and this is also, part of how these letters were written in the first place, which is to say that Paul isn't probably sitting down writing these things out himself. He's using secretaries. He's using amanuensis to kind of, he's dictating these things. And so I like to encourage my students to kind of see him just pacing around a room, just talking while people are sketching out what he's saying. But yeah, in 1 Corinthians, he says, thank God I didn't baptize you anyone, or thank God I didn't baptize any of you. Well, except for you, and then the entire family of this person, right? So he's like, but other than that, I can't remember, except for maybe so-and-so. But yeah, so he's kind of, but no, so we know like Paul's position as the traveling preacher who is out spreading the word and then writing letters or whatever. It would be really, really, I just can't imagine thinking like Paul was the only one doing that, right? Because if he's talking about other people who are traveling around, the sort of genre of the missionary journey, right? He is one of the people who is undertaking this task. And so there have to be others as well, right? So there's other letters.
It would make him genuinely revolutionary if he was the only one.
Right.
And I mean, maybe he was, but like, if he really, he didn't invent letter writing because loads of elite Romans did that.
We do have other letters. We do have other letters aside from Paul. We have letters from soldiers. We have letters from emperors. We have all of those things. Paul absolutely did not create the ancient epistle.
Yeah. And then we have letters from later generations of Christians. We don't absolutely have letters from that age, but
correct.
Balance of probabilities there must have been is sort of where you land with that. We just don't know what they were.
Well, right, and on the same and the other side of that coin, we have these letters from Paul, whether authentic or not. But then we have plenty of other letters that Paul probably wrote that aren't preserved, right? And so you can imagine personal correspondence, right? If Paul is writing a letter to an individual, that is a lot less likely to survive than a letter that is written to, let's say, the Christians who are in Rome, which there's more, whatever. And so we have individual correspondence from Paul. Most of it is the inauthentic Paul, right? So 1 Timothy and Titus, or 2 Timothy and Titus are presented as personal correspondence, but the only personal correspondence we have that is certainly Paul, or almost certainly Paul, is Philemon, which is written to an individual. And well, why was that one preserved? And truthfully, we don't know. That's actually one of those big conundrums of, Romans is preserved because it was written to a bigger group. It was then copied. It was sent on to other groups. It was sort of whatever. But why would anyone have?
Isn't a big reason for stuff like Philemon, because they had it and because it was by Paul. It's probably like they just someone was going through their desk drawer and they're like, oh shit, we've got this is also by Paul. Get that in. Like it might not be more just like dumb luck.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, there's all sorts of fun little fan theories about how Philemon comes to exist, because it's written to Philemon, probably carried by Onesimus, who Paul is talking about as an enslaved person. And then, but you know, how does that letter end up in the desk drawer, I guess, is the big question, right? And
because I was just clearing out the room upstairs and I'm finding like my sister's middle school textbook. Is that like a valuable thing? It just happened to, I don't know. That's my dumbass theory, but
yeah. No,
what do I know?
Philemon is one of those, and probably somebody has written on this, and maybe it's not as much of a mystery as I think, but that's one that's always mystified me, is to say, like, you know, if I send an email out to faculty at my college, or let's say I print a memo and send it out and it gets circulated, the chances that some copy of that memo survives 200 years from now are a lot better than a birthday card that I send to my mother. That's not going to be around in 200 years because there's only one copy of it and there's no reason for anyone to make a copy. So Philemon is one of those texts that it doesn't necessarily break the mold, but it also really gets us thinking about where do these texts come from, and you know, what was so special about them, and how do some texts like Philemon, how do those texts really even stay on the radar of people? It's kind of a conundrum. Yeah.
Moving forward a bit, because like all of this, you could like spend an entire interview on all of it. Is Mark the first gospel? Is he not the first preserved, but is he the first one to try and do a life of Jesus narrative form?
Yeah, that's a really, really ultimately an interesting question that I probably can't give a firm answer to. Mark is definitely the first gospel that we have that is preserved, and the earliest that Mark could have been written is 70. And so the temple in Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans in 70. Jesus in Mark references that event, and so it is 100% certain that he is at least writing after that. Probably, I mean, some people like to say Mark was written in 70. I prefer to say probably 5 to 10 years after these events at the earliest. But regardless, Mark is absolutely the earliest preserved gospel that we have at the moment. In terms of whether there were other gospels, I mean, there are sort of fragments here and there of other kind of materials, but in terms of a full-throated kind of life of Jesus, like Mark is writing, and you know, and the story that Mark is writing fits really well in with the genre of the ancient biography. So Mark is not creating a genre here. He's not doing something completely new, and really, are any of us ever doing something completely new, right? We're always deriving something from something else. So I mean, I like to imagine that there are. I mean, my historian mind likes to imagine that there are other gospels sort of floating around out there, and that Mark is participating in that genre. But also, we just don't have a whole lot of evidence for it. I think what we have is evidence of things like collections of sayings. I think we probably do have, stories that are preserved, but in terms of a big, kind of one large treatment of like life to death, and then the big asterisk at the end of like, was it really dead? Whatever that I think Mark is probably, without more evidence to the contrary, I like to think of Mark as kind of the first gospel.
Here's my argument, and this is prefaced with a massive "I'm not a specialist, what the hell do I know" qualifier. Here's my argument for Mark as not the first Christian writing, but the first full life to death, as you say, narrative, is I was always a bit fuzzy for a long time on, like, did Mark know Paul? And I read Robin Faith Walsh's early Christian literature book, and then I was like, oh yeah, he
Lovely
knew
book.
Paul. Yeah, like that just locked that one in for me. And I think if you line up the bits of Mark and Paul that kind of correspond, what you can see is, because there's some sayings, like the divorce saying corresponds, and then there's the resurrection account. There's a very minimal account in First Corinthians where it's like died up in 3 days, but none of the colour. If you line it up, what it kind of looks like is Mark has Paul or something like him, a tradition in the church, something in the liturgy, a list of sayings that Paul also has. He has Paul or something like him, and he's got the very bare bones, and then he's adding meat to them with his knowledge of existing Jewish scripture and kind of just like Greco-Roman literary tropes, like a lot of the sort of the detail he adds to the very minimal died, rose in 3 days, like the empty tomb and stuff, all has antecedents in Greco-Roman literature. And sort of extrapolating that model out a bit, I think that's just kind of what he's doing in general. He has some stuff we don't have. He has Paul. He probably has some other letters. He probably has early liturgies. He might have like a sayings list. And he's kind of just like putting literary meat on the bones. And what tips it for me is at some points, he clearly doesn't expect his audience to know the story that he's telling. So at some point, right? Like, I think particularly with the Passion, but at other points as well. So that to me says this actually is the first. There's definitely antecedent materials he's drawing from.
Yes.
But this actually, and I think there were others between him and all the others that we've lost. But the first, he's like actually legit, or something close to it. Maybe there's textual corruption or whatever. But something close to that is the first full narrative account. That's my argument. But again, what do I know?
I think that's certainly something I could get on board with. I think when we're dealing with pre-Markan material outside of Paul, I think we're dealing with small pieces of material, small pieces of tradition, right? Because Paul has small pieces of tradition, right? Paul has the kind of Last Supper narrative. Paul has, and Paul's very, very honest about the fact that he's using source material, right? Paul never meets Jesus personally, but he also says things like, I have a saying from the Lord about this. Well, where does that come from, right? And it's either something that's written somewhere, or it's something that is just so. It's probably written somewhere because we see these things kind of verbatim. I think you have fragmentary circulating traditions, but then I think because whatever material that Mark is getting from Paul also had to get that material from somewhere, and so unless he's making it up, which seems certainly unlikely. So at least for me. But
so okay, then here's the controversial one. Because we said, we don't have to go into the dating, but we've got Mark is the first. Everyone basically agrees that, right?
Right.
And Mark is like, we debate, was it exactly 70 or was it maybe 75? That's still like a reasonably tight date range.
Oh, yeah. Anything within like 30 or 40 years for me is like pretty precise when you're dealing with ancient history.
Yeah, I don't think personally we have an exact date for like Jesus's death or when Paul was writing. It's like within a decade is as good as you're going to do. Okay, so then my next question is, because this opens up multiple cans of worms that are currently contentious, what else was out there between Mark and the last of the canonicals to be written? Were there other gospels? Can we think about what they might have looked like? Do we still have any of them?
Yeah.
Take as long as you want with that one, because I'm asking you to...
Yeah. So the way that the timeline usually works, right, is that wherever we put Mark, whether that's 70 or 80 or even later than that, maybe, we know without any doubt that Matthew and Luke are both using Mark, and we know that because they're quoting him. And then we also know that they are quoting from a shared source of some sort that we call Q, just an abbreviation for the German word for source. And it's a hypothetical source that, you know, seems to have probably, maybe, who knows? There's a big can of worms of whether Q exists, but
like I said, this is where it gets controversial.
Yeah, this is where it gets really, I mean, you can, many spend careers unpacking this, but there's a big debate in our field about, you know, well, do you really even need Q to explain the relationship between Matthew and Luke? Maybe there's an easier explanation. I won't get too far into that, but, you know, I teach both in my classes because I think they're both good theories. But so in between kind of Mark and the Matthew and Luke phenomenon, you know, there seems to be some kind of other sources.
There's
like
stream of material there, whether or not Matthew and Luke knew it independently or whether Luke just picked it up secondhand from Matthew. It doesn't seem like Matthew was making that up wholesale. He's drawing on something.
Right. Yeah, no, and I think, Matthew and Luke are both drawing from something. And they're both also drawing from, you know, you have what we call special Matthew material, which is only, you know, like the Magi are only in Matthew. And then you have special Luke material, like the parable of the prodigal son. Well, either Luke has gotten that story from somewhere, which is, I think, likely, or he has just created it out of whole cloth. And there certainly are instances in Luke and Matthew where we think that these authors probably did create material, but you know, so you do have that kind of body of material in between the kind of Gospels, because Matthew and Luke clearly are drawing from Mark as well as other sources. Luke, in his preface, tells readers that he's using other sources. He says, you know, when he's writing to Theophilus, whoever that is, and then he says, many have done this before, right? Many have undertaken to, you know, give you a orderly account or whatever. So I too am going to give you this orderly account.
That to me is like, we get so little in the Gospels themselves that speaks to authorship or dating or sources. There's bits, there's fragments, there's hints here and there, but that's as close as you're going to get to them saying, like that's as close as you're going to get to like a bibliography, right? Is Luke saying, just as many have done this before.
And then also going on to describe the nature of his sources, right? And he doesn't do this in any real depth, but what he says is, I mean, a couple of things that he identifies is, number one, this is not the first time somebody has done this. He's very, very straightforward about that. And number two, Luke tells you, or whoever the author is, we call him Luke for the sake of simplicity, but Luke tells you that he's not an eyewitness to anything he's talking about. Yeah. Because he says the stuff that was handed on to us by those who were eyewitnesses. Now, that's a whole nother debate on the value of eyewitness testimony, or whether Luke is actually using anything from people who were there.
Here's what I'm not clear on. Is Luke claiming there to have talked to eyewitnesses, or is he just saying at one point there were eyewitnesses and there's kind of, could you translate into sort of modern jargon? I am working from a textual tradition. I'm also working from some sort of like oral remembrances that have been handed down.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, based on the work that I've done with ancient biography, I mean, there is a lot of literary, but there's also people who are writing these pieces, who are writing closer in proximity to the events that they claim to be writing about. There does seem to be a kind of awareness that being there or talking to people who were there is actually of some value. So like the very famous passage from Thucydides that I think every historiography class probably starts with, when he talks about how he deals with the speeches in his history of the Peloponnesian War. And he says some of these speeches I was there for, some of them I heard from others. And then he says, in all cases, I have made the speaker say what I believe is appropriate for them. So he's like, I was there for these things, but also nobody can remember what anyone said. So I just kind of tried to capture the gist. It would be like, and it was somebody like Luke writing about Jesus. It would be like me going into my class one day and saying to the class, you all are to write Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, and you can't use any sources. All you can do is just kind of talk amongst yourselves. But in the end, you have to produce a 15-minute speech for me.
Yeah.
Well, that's not, there's going to be a few similarities there. But yeah, I think that the nature of Luke's sources,
if Luke was an eyewitness, he would have said it. Like, he wants to stress his own.
Yeah.
He's doing what ancient authors do, where they lay out their own, what all authors do really, is where they lay out their own qualifications. And his qualifications are, I've read what other people have written, and I maybe have some sort of like oral tradition as well. But like, I've done my research. I think if he could add to that, and let me tell you I was there, he would have, wouldn't he?
Yeah. Well, I think so. I mean, and there's some, I've heard it said before, like, oh no, the ancient readers wouldn't have, and historians or whatever wouldn't necessarily have put much stock in that. I actually don't think that's true.
The other thing I would say about eyewitnesses is, I don't view it as like my job as a secular person. Look, believe what you want to believe, to really like debunk the idea that these are eyewitness documents, but also they just weren't.
Yeah, they weren't.
And one of the things that strikes me is, far from being a sort of this is authoritative, this is the final word, like the way they're documents that are very concerned often to establish, often subtly, where they got their information from. Both Matthew and John will say things like, and the centurion wrote it down, and that's how we know this. Now, whether or not that actually happened historically is probably pretty dubious, but the documents themselves are quite sensitive to the charge of, like, where are you getting this from? And that just really doesn't speak to eyewitness, I don't think.
Well, and with eyewitness stuff, I mean, you also kind of have to back up and ask the question, because I've got a lot of students who come to my classes having been taught that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John are disciples of Jesus and or at the very least eyewitnesses to the things that they are talking about. Okay. So first of all, if that's true, then all of them saw different things, because they don't agree on a lot of things, right? If anyone is listening to this thinking, well, that's not true, go and read the resurrection accounts. If these are written by eyewitnesses, then they didn't do a great job of remembering. But that also leads to the kind of second concern with eyewitnesses, which is that people don't remember things very well. They just don't.
It's both that they don't agree and that they agree too much. Like, eyewitnesses wouldn't have 50-word strings of verbatim agreement between them if they're independent. So, I mean, the only one, someone challenged me once of, couldn't Mark be an eyewitness? Or like, there's a testimonium from Papias, is it? That he was an interpreter of Peter. And like, an interpreter of maybe. Like, that's maybe, right? Like, sure, but the rest of them weren't. Like Luke basically tells us that he's not.
Luke basically tells us that he's not, and the closest that you get to the claim of being an eyewitness in Luke Acts is in Acts. You have these really, really weird, what's called the we passages, right? These really strange instances where the author is describing the journeys of Paul, and then on occasion he will talk about and then we went here and we went there.
Which is why Luke is traditionally assigned as a traveling companion of Paul. Like, that's where we get that from, right?
Yeah, and then by the second century, late second century, when the pastoral letters are being written, Luke is mentioned there as a traveling companion of Paul, which is sort of this kind of gradual coalescing of these sources as interrelated and all of that. But no, I mean, they're not eyewitnesses. Could they be working from sources that were passed along as, so and so saw this or whatever? Yes, sure. But then also, again, what are people? What do people stand to gain from these things being eyewitness accounts? Presumably, if you say, well, so and so is an eyewitness, that means that what you're reading is accurate. But if all of these sources don't agree fully with each other, I mean, they get close a lot, but if they don't fully agree with each other, then you kind of have to acknowledge that the claim to an eyewitness testimony doesn't really do what you think it does, right? It's sort of, it's not a guaranteed accuracy.
I've done a couple of really interviews on the historic Jesus. My view, which I don't really see it as like, I think some people really want to prove we know all this is historical. I think there's also a tribe of people who really want to prove that like Jesus was a complete fabrication and a myth, and I think that's just a bias in the other direction. If I try to be objective, recognizing that there is so much thing, I would say it kind of depends on how reliable we think Mark's sources were. Because he's kind of like the font on all of this. You've got a little bit you can hack out of Paul. And let's say we generally believe Paul because he knew James and Peter. Like, if Paul cites a saying, that's like better than 50%. That's true. And then anything else, do we think Mark is getting what he's getting because he's heard Peter preach, as Papias says? Or is he getting it a bit later down? Is he getting stuff that like might have been invented by other early Christians, to which I think we just don't know. And I think you just have to live with that not knowing. Some of it probably maybe, but are we talking like 20% like tracks to a historical Jesus or 80%? I don't have a hard time with either of those numbers. I don't know how you'd pass that.
Yeah, and ultimately that is that's the challenge, right? And I'm not really sure that we can definitively come to any conclusion on, what percent accuracy or anything like that. I mean, we're dealing with an author who is writing probably 50 years after the events that he's claiming to narrate happened. And so what's happened during that 50 years is, well, Paul, so let's not underestimate that value, and other early Christian teachers. But I don't like to be an absolute skeptic, but I don't really see a whole lot of, I don't really see a way to confirm how the degree of accuracy of Mark's account, right? Like, how accurate is this? Well, if you have nothing to compare it to,
well, you've got nothing independent because everyone else has read Mark. So like,
exactly, yeah.
Do they agree because they're just taking it from Mark, or do they agree? I don't think there's any way to do that.
And it also compounds to say, well, maybe they don't even have to have been reading Mark. They are, Mark is sort of, in addition to a work of literature, Mark is also sort of capturing the moment of how, he's writing down the life of Jesus, but certainly, like we've talked about, certainly people kind of have a sense of some of these events, right? And so Mark is kind of, you can sort of know, maybe broadly speaking, what Mark is talking about without having read Mark. Like, Mark gives you a unique construal of the oral and written tradition, right? But certainly that has to exist somewhere else, right? You have people who are perhaps not writing full-on gospels, but you still kind of have a sense of sequence and those sorts of things, I think. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does. Okay, so to pull us forward then, because we could spend all the time on just Mark and his sources. Mm-hmm. Paul's writing, we have some of his letters. There almost certainly were more Paul. There probably was more other people. They didn't survive, and yet for some reason we have this weird message Paul has sending a slave home, but sure. Right. We get Mark, who maybe has antecedents, but that's the first. You'll then get the other Gospels, but there's definitely, between Mark and the other canonicals, there's definitely other Gospels being written.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to them? Does any of that survive? Is Thomas, for instance, early? I've heard people say maybe it is. I've heard people say it isn't. And I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that it is, if we've got.
And if you want to explain it at some point what Thomas is as well.
Sure, yeah. Well, so Thomas, the Gospel of Thomas is a collection of sayings of Jesus. There's also some, and some of them are mirrored pretty closely in the synoptics. And some of them are just really, really out there.
Yes.
And so Thomas has been cataloged by many as a kind of Gnostic text. I don't find the terminology of Gnosticism to be all that helpful, but it's a category. It's doing something a little different than the Synoptics. But there's no real narrative structure to Thomas at all. It's basically, when we think about what something like Q, a collection of sayings, what something like that could look like, Thomas shows us that these things are, that thinking about a collection of sayings isn't actually all that out there. Thomas isn't Q, we're fairly certain, and we only have the full text in Coptic. But it sort of gives that, okay, we could have had a collection of sayings. But yeah, Thomas, I think Thomas, coming out of that kind of second century, maybe even early second century, I think that's pretty reasonable.
Really? So Thomas might have been around the time of Matthew or something?
I don't find that completely unreasonable personally. Now, I have not done the deepest dive possible into Thomas scholarship, and so I'll issue that with the caveat of fact check me. But no, I think that the late first, early second century, later second century, I think this era is where you do get a ramping up of Christian literary production. And so, something like Thomas, was Thomas as widespread as Mark? No, because we just don't have as many copies of it, right? And Mark, we see, is something that it sort of takes off, and there are copies and copies and copies being made. We don't have that as much with Thomas. We do have some Greek fragments, but it's clearly not as popular of a text. And I think that's where we can kind of come back to answer this question. Were there other gospels? Most certainly, yes. Were there dozens like Dan Brown would have us believe? Probably not. Although maybe, who knows? But they didn't survive for whatever reason. And the most likely reason why they didn't survive is that people just weren't reading them. And that's either because people didn't like them, or they weren't circulated like the other gospels were. But yeah, I think in terms of other gospels that were being written around the time of Matthew and Luke, there's no doubt in my mind that we have plenty of other texts out there that just don't exist anymore.
Yeah, and maybe Thomas is one of them. Maybe it's a bit later.
Yep. No, I think you could. I think there's with all of these texts, I think that you can point to, this is the earliest that it could have been written, and then there's also, this is the latest it could have been written. And with Thomas, we have a range.
As you get to the very tail end of the first century, early second, you get your first sort of attestations of this. You've got Josephus in 96 has some mention that maybe has been tampered with about Christianity. And then early second, you get this weird little line in Papias. Okay, I'll just say what I thought. When I first read the Josephus testimonium, my first thought was, Josephus didn't write that. Josephus wrote something that was like mentioned Christ, mentioned Jesus, and then some later Christian dork overwrote it and made it like, and he was really God and really hammed it up. And I was pleased to learn actually that's the majority historic view.
Right.
And so maybe I'm not such a dumbass. But is there anything more to it than that, and that can be hacked out of it than that? That Josephus maybe said something in the late 90s about this, but what exactly it was, we're not quite sure, because it looks like it's been tampered with. Is there anything more to be said on that?
Yeah, I think it's yeah. I mean, I tend to see the testimonium as a corruption, a textual corruption, but not. I don't think it's completely out of bounds that Josephus would have mentioned Jesus, because Josephus is in this work talking about the kind of, I mean, he's talking about Rome, and he's talking about Judea, and I do think that by the 90s, I mean, by the 90s, you do certainly have a recognizable group of Jesus followers, right? You have a group of people. It's not a huge group, but it's enough of a group that they have an identity, and so Josephus is kind of, I think, just acknowledging, like, yeah, there's this other religious group that, you know, Jesus and the Romans killed him, and then whatever. But then, yeah, I think the corruption comes in with, with whatever monks are
Yeah.
are helping us to have Josephus today. Somebody either knowingly is kind of tampering with, or somebody else says, you know what, yeah, Josephus was a I don't know. I don't know where it came from. There is an article that came out not too long ago, within the last few years, and now that I'm blanking on the details because I didn't know we were going to talk about Josephus. There is an article that argues that the testimonium is authentic to Josephus, and I can't remember where it was published, but I'll send it to you later, and you can post it with. Yeah.
I just watched an interview that argued there's kind of, it strongly parallels a passage in Luke, someone argued recently, and that then maybe Josephus is dependent on Luke, although elsewhere people have argued that Luke is dependent on Josephus, or at least Acts is. So I don't know. I hope both sides have fun. Yeah,
it's a chicken or the egg. It's a chicken or the egg question of who's dependent on what. But I mean, I think, you can sort of what you can hack out of Josephus mentioning Jesus, and what you can hack out of that is that there were stories circulating, right? I mean, that's the Josephus is capturing he's capturing a part of the tradition. And so you can sort of see from that by the late first century, you still, I mean, I don't know. I don't imagine a world where Josephus is sitting down and reading the Gospel of Luke. I just don't see it. Maybe that's just me, but I just don't see it. But I could have
been written by then, because people are really pushing that it hasn't at the moment.
And there's plenty of movement within the guild to suggest that Luke is written, and Luke and Acts are both early 2nd century. I mean, we just don't know. Yeah. So
another bit.
But
no, go ahead.
Did I lag?
No. I just interrupted you.
Okay. No, my internet froze for a second. You're gonna have all sorts of editing to do on this. No, I can't really imagine a world where Josephus is reading Luke, but I could imagine a world where Luke is reading Josephus. I think
that sounds right to me. And if you look at the parallels, there's like a very loose parallel between the testimonial and this like one line in Luke, but then. There's like, I forget who did it recently, but there is like the sort of parallels between Acts and Josephus, and there's quite a few, and they're not like bulletproof. They're not like Matthew knew Mark, but they're like, maybe sort of thing. But then that brings us forward to the Papias thing, where he sort of says, "Oh, here's my origin story for Mark, which we've talked about. Right. Here's my origin story for Matthew." Except they both kind of, so either he's talking about Matthew and Mark as we know it now and just getting some details wrong, or he's talking about something else which we don't have anymore. Do you have a sense on that either way?
I mean, I think either of those are, is my memory of the Papias stuff, he is, now I can't remember. I know other early Christian authors are claiming that Matthew is written in Hebrew.
Papias does, yes.
So Papias does, okay. And that's wrong. I mean, that's just completely 100% incorrect. So if you do have a gospel written in Hebrew, it's definitely not Matthew. Right. Because Matthew has I mean, there's pretty clear evidence that Matthew is originally composed in Greek.
Right.
So that's one instance where, Papias claimed this, but it's like, well, that's not right. So either he's wrong about Matthew or he's talking about another text. And then he says this thing about Mark. Well, either he's not, either he's right about that and wrong about Matthew, or he's wrong about both. Yeah. Or he's talking about two different texts that we don't have anymore, or he's talking about two different texts that we do have but aren't Matthew and Mark.
Yeah,
if that makes sense. Yeah. So it's with Papias. I mean, Papias is kind of a funny thing because I tend to put not a whole lot of stock into like this one person says this, therefore that's true. I mean, it's interesting, right? But like just because Papias says something doesn't mean that like, well, he's closer to the events. That doesn't matter, right? So yeah. You sort of have to take it as an interesting thought experiment, and also it could independently corroborate something else that we've seen, right? Like Mark and parallels with Pauline material, like that's real. And so Papias helps to say like, oh, well, maybe, you have this ancient author who is also saying that Mark and Paul were kind of in cahoots, but then also he shows you evidence that we can only put so much stock in what these folks are saying when he says things like Matthew was written in Hebrew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's an argument that maybe he thinks he is talking about Matthew, but he thinks what he has is a Greek translation of a Hebrew text.
Yeah.
Which, like, other people have made that mistake with Matthew, that they think it was originally in Hebrew, which it wasn't. But anyway, although, following on, what he doesn't mention is Luke or John. Does that mean he doesn't know them and that they possibly haven't been written yet? Or we just, who knows?
Who knows? I mean, I think it is extremely possible that he simply doesn't know these texts. We think in terms today of, I could write a paragraph today, and if it was interesting enough, then 1 million people could read it by the end of the day. It won't be interesting enough, but we are dealing in the ancient world with circulation that takes a while. And we don't really have publishing apparatuses, and all of those sorts of things. So yeah, it's entirely possible that somebody could know Matthew and Mark and not know the others. A great example of this, coming back to the Proto-Gospel of James, the Proto-Gospel of James very clearly knows Matthew, Luke, and John. The argument has been made that the author of the Proto-Gospel of James does not know Mark. Which is, and it's interesting because there aren't, so the argument goes, there aren't any uniquely Markan features of the text, right? So so there's very clear references, like the Magi appear in the Proto-Gospel of James, which means he knows Matthew or Matthean traditions. There's all sorts of little Johannine references, and then Luke as well. There's the census and all of that stuff, but there's no uniquely Markan features. So when we're looking at these early authors, they're not operating with the complete New Testament. They're operating with whatever text they have on hand at the time.
Although that does give you a sort of last possible date, is that like if I'm just going to call it I've been mispronouncing it, the Proto-Gospel of James, if that's late 2nd century, then that's like the latest the canonical Gospels could have been written. I think there's stuff in the middle of the 2nd century as well that sort of seems to know them and so you look like maybe 150 as a sort of cutoff point.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that and there are some who push the Proto-Gospel into the 3rd century. I'm a late 2nd century proponent, but no, I think the Proto-Gospel as a kind of it's almost like a partial sort of gospel harmony, because it's telling all of these stories by bringing together material from Matthew, from Luke, and from John, and so it's kind of trying to harmonize. But those texts certainly existed at least before that text was written, and probably decades before, because they needed time to circulate.
Is there any, we've mentioned Thomas, is there any other Gospels that, like, could maybe fit in the middle, as in, like, might have been written concurrent with something like Luke or John, or the other sort of, like, there's a lot of infancy Gospels. Like, are they all drawing from, in terms of infancy stuff, presumably Matthew and Luke?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, the earlier stuff, there was, I once heard
realize
somebody.
I'm sort of making you take a stab at stuff to which the only valid answer is we kind of don't know.
Yeah,
but...
I'm just going to throw up my hands, and I'll preface every answer with throwing up my hands. But no, there was I was at a conference once, and somebody remarked, as somebody was taking a later Syriac text and really trying to argue that there was a 2nd century Greek original, and it was Tony Burke, who does Apocrypha stuff, and he leaned over and said something along the lines of, everyone wants there to be a 2nd century Greek original. And and that's always kind of stuck with me. It's because we really, the sort of 2nd century Greek original is the, when you're studying apocryphal stuff, everyone wants their text to be as old as possible, right? And so, but a lot of these texts, I mean, with the proto-gospel, we actually do have pretty good evidence that it's a 2nd century text. But with a lot of these other texts, we don't have manuscript evidence of them until later. And so pushing it back, it's sort of just throwing up your hands and going, well, it could be 2nd century, but it could also be several hundred years later than that. And so the dating of these things, and in part because they're just how they've been preserved, and which is to say they haven't been preserved as well as New Testament texts because they weren't as popular. But in terms of, like, why do we have so many infancy gospels? And we have a lot of infancy gospels. And the proto-gospel seems to be the first, proto-gospel of James, but then you have others, gospel pseudo-Matthew, Arabic infancy gospel, Armenian infancy gospel. And all of these things they're drawing from Matthew and Luke, but they're also drawing from other infancy gospels. So the proto-gospel of James becomes a primary source for a lot of the people who are writing.
So this is like a
later.
whole branch of the tree.
Yeah, I think so.
I guess that would be the other way you could maybe not date, but think about dating, is you don't have the physical text the way that there's some copies of Matthew that go back. But you can say, okay, well, this has clearly read this, and then this has clearly read. Are they all branching out of Mark and Luke, and then each other?
Yeah, I think Matthew and Luke are certainly, and Mark actually, are kind of seed beds for later reflection. And I think, I mean, my personal professional opinion on this, where do these things come from and why are there so many, is, I mean, Mark doesn't have an infancy gospel. And so Matthew and Luke, both independently or together, if you take the non-Q theory, we won't get into that, but Matthew and Luke both have a kind of dissatisfaction with Mark, starting with just a full-grown Jesus, right? Mark has a mother of Jesus, and so Matthew and Luke are taking that and going, okay, we're going to dial things back a little bit and say, we're not going to start the story with Jesus' ministry. We're going to start the story with Jesus' birth, right? And so, and John, whether John knows the synoptics or not is another big question. But John, I think,
He did.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think even where he's not quoting, I think he shows awareness of synoptic traditions in the way that he pushes back. This is
the one area where I will confidently state an opinion that is contested by professional historians. Because did Q exist? My opinion is I hope both sides have fun. It seems like a lovely debate.
Right.
John knew the synoptics. Like, it's the same story. The Passion is the same story with the same beats, and Peter denies 3 times. No, come on, this isn't completely independent. Like, I'm not going to specify exactly what they're doing. He's read Mark. He's definitely read Mark. Anyway.
Well, and I think, I mean, just as a kind of anecdote, I mean, one of the stories that I'm working on right now as a possible kind of research trajectory is the traditions about Simon of Cyrene, who carries the cross of Jesus. And he appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but he doesn't appear in John. But in John, the author says Jesus carried his cross, and then he adds by himself. and so there it's like, well, you clearly know at least the story of Simon.
I think at multiple points John corrects against Matthew and Luke.
I agree.
Like there's the bit at the very end where he's like, now you might have heard he said it like this, and he said he would never die, but he didn't. Let me tell you.
Right.
He's correcting against this idea that Jesus said some of you will live to see me return. Right. He's like, right. No, that's not what it is. And there's so many points where he's saying the story in Matthew where he has him riding 2 donkeys coming in to Jerusalem, and it's John's like, crazy. You might have heard some other version of this, and it wasn't.
Right. Well, that's there's 2 things there. That's number one.
I'm drawing this onto a whole other thing, but
the story of the two animals in Matthew is one of the clearest places where, like, this author is not writing in Hebrew. Here's an example of a place where this author misunderstands Hebrew poetry, right? Because he has Jesus walking in on or riding in on 2 animals, which is like, well, that's misunderstanding the source that he's drawing from. But with John, no, I think John is in many ways kind of offering that corrective. And to come back to the question about eyewitnesses, I think John is the only one of the evangelists who is very self-consciously trying to convince his readers that he, wink, wink, might have been there. And he does this, right, through the lens of the beloved disciple, right? The beloved disciple is the one who saw these things, and there's all these interjections, right? The one who saw this has told you so that you can believe, or whatever. And then, and then there's also that weird anecdote about, like, the beloved disciple runs faster than Peter or whatever, which is kind of fun. Like, he made it to the other tomb first, or to the tomb first. But no, so coming back to this sort of, like, the proliferation of infancy gospels, and and I think with Matthew and Luke's impulse to say, well, let's start earlier than Jesus's ministry. Let's start with conception, or however we want to frame that. I think John has that impulse too, because John doesn't include a story of Jesus's birth, but John dials things back all the way to the start. Jesus wasn't, we don't even need to talk about Jesus's birth. What matters is that Jesus has always existed, right? The sort of divine logos of the prologue. And so all of those things, Matthew, Luke, and John, kind of feeling like they need to start earlier. I think all of those things, we see that in infancy gospels. Like the proto-gospel of James is going, well, I know the story of how Jesus was born, but what about Mary, right? And then you have that kind of, dialing back. But I think a lot of the impulse behind a lot of apocryphal literature is in that either correction of, somebody doesn't like a story, or they don't like a detail of a story, so they kind of rewrite that story with the detail that they don't like fixed. Or you have the impulse to kind of, we want to know what we don't know. And so if you have Matthew and Luke saying Jesus is born to a woman named Mary, who's a virgin, who's all these, there's all sorts of questions like, well, what was her childhood like? And, how was she selected to be the mother of Jesus? And, and those are all questions that authors of Apocrypha are trying to answer. They're trying to fill in those narrative gaps. And, and they're doing that, coming full circle, not just by making up material, but they're doing that by conveying folk tales, oral traditions that they have, or maybe even written sources. The author of the proto-gospel is probably making up some of this stuff, but he's also drawing from traditions that exist probably about Mary and her parents, and he's reworking tropes from the Septuagint, and he's reworking those into, like, let's tell these stories about somebody else. But yeah, I think that a lot of these apocryphal texts, infancy gospels are a wonderful example. I think a lot of these texts are coming from a desire to know the full story and to kind of make sure that it's the full story and it's the correct story.
But we don't do. I mean, you could think of modern analogues in that we've got, you have Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and then it's like, oh well, where did this Willy Wonka guy come from? We'd best make a film about his origin, or like, here's how Cruella de Vil became evil and hated Dalmatians. Like, we've got to have a film about that for some reason.
Right.
Like, it's not a totally different species of thing.
No, and it really isn't. And it's the example, a great example of this that has started to fall flat lately because of how old these films are. But a great example of this is Star Wars, right? And you have the kind of, and this comes back to that question of canon versus non-canon, right? And so if you ask people of like, what is the canon of Star Wars films? Well, what is that going to be? Is it the original trilogy? Certainly the prequels or whatever episodes 1, 2, and 3. I know people have very mixed opinions on these things, but there's all sorts of Star Wars material out there. There's the Christmas episode, which I've never seen, but apparently it's just atrocious and nobody talks about it, right? Because it's like it was an official thing, but it's terrible. And so what counts as canon and what counts as kind of ancillary? And you've got all these other little films like, what's the one? Rogue One, right? Well, what is this film doing? Well, it's filling a gap, and it's almost like it's taking the big, however many there are now, 6 or 9, depends on who you ask, and it's occupying a middle ground between 2 of the episodes and saying, here's what happened between these 2 episodes. The Mandalorian does the same thing. And I'm actually not a huge Star Wars geek, but I know these things because we talk about them in class. But all of those little those smaller little series and the smaller little episodes.
I've given up with Star Wars at this point. Nothing like, if you like it, cool, that's your thing. I just like, at a certain point, I'm like, yeah, like I say, I hope everyone has fun,
My fascination with Star Wars is that I enjoy, feeling like a 10 or a 12-year-old again. I don't consume myself too often with fan fiction theories and those sorts of things. But that's fan fiction is a good way to think about these, all of these texts, right? So, you could, it's a mistake to just say that, the Proto-Gospel of James is a fan fiction account of Matthew and Luke and whatever other stories that he's got in there. Matthew is also technically fan fiction of Mark, right? I mean, if he's taking Mark and he's expanding it and he's filling in the gaps and also including
I was
stories.
just going to say, like the literary processes that we're talking about, you
Right.
know, are not just there's this thing which is the canon and then they took it and made the expanded Jesus cinematic universe. Those processes are already in play in the canonical texts, in that Matthew and Luke are taking Mark and going, I feel like we kind of need a bit more of a lead in here. We need to know how these characters got here. And then they're putting in stuff they know, or honestly, I think probably just making stuff up at some points.
Well, or look at what Acts does with Paul. I mean, Acts takes Paul, who says, Paul talks about not agreeing with Peter, right? And Paul in his letters is very different than the Paul that we see in Acts. And the Acts author is taking Paul and saying, I'm going to tell a story where this person is more cooperative and where there's but try matching up Paul's conversion story in Acts with the story that Paul tells about the same event in Galatians.
Well, they just don't. And they also have literally metaphysically different understandings of the universe, those two authors. One question talking about, so I'm just going to pick just everything I wonder about, but one question I've never locked down in my head is, I think we can begin to flesh out a picture for what Luke's sources for the gospel are. He's clearly got Mark, maybe has Matthew, maybe has some other stuff that Matthew also has, right? Mm-hmm. And just some other stuff that we don't have. He says many have written before me, probably at least 3 or 4 things in front of him, right?
Right.
What were Luke's sources for Acts? That, that's one that I just have never wrapped my head around, because he might have Josephus for some of the Jewish history stuff. Cool.
Yeah.
Does he have Paul's letters as we know them? Because he never references them. Does he have other Pauline letters? Where's he? I mean, my sense of the we passages, we did this, is that maybe nothing more complicated than editorial fatigue. Like he's working from a source and then just accidentally copies that language in.
Gotcha.
But
yeah.
But like what? Where's, because he's not, I don't think he's, although it's very different from Paul at some points, there's enough overlap that it's not completely fabricated. But like, and like Paul gives 3 different speeches in Acts, all of which are different from each other and from the historic Paul. So like,
right.
Where's that come from? And from Luke's own theology. So
right.
So where's that come from? And like that, maybe the answer is we just can't know. But like, what set of texts are behind that is something I have never even got close to getting my head around.
Yeah, well, and I think the answer to that is probably that there's a lot of stuff that we don't have anymore. Now, going back to my comment about Thucydides and the writing of speeches in the Peloponnesian War, and he talks about basically how the speeches in that text are his speeches, right? I have written these speeches for these people. So that applies to Luke as well. Luke is telling a history, and the way that ancient historians are dealing with speeches that they don't have copied, written down, is that they are creating these speeches, and they are making the characters say what they want them to say, certainly trying to adhere. This is what Thucydides says. He's like, I tried to adhere to what was said, but also like I had to make some guesses. And that matters because 25% of Acts is speeches.
Oh, wow. Okay. I mean,
25%.
Yeah.
25%. If you take all of the speeches out of Acts, you have 3/4 of what you have in the standard New Testament. So 25% of this text, we know from what we know about ancient historiography, we know that 25% of this text is the author writing texts writing speeches for the characters. So that's significant, which means that Paul's speeches in Acts are really Luke's speeches for Paul. Now, does this author have the letters of Paul? I think personally that he does. I think that at least some. I think that at least this author has some. If Paul is writing in the, let's say, just 50s, let's just put that like 50s, give or take, and Paul is dead in the 60s, then if Acts is an early 2nd century text, then that's 60
It would seem weird that he wouldn't.
It would seem weird that he wouldn't. Yeah, if you've got other people, like Marcion has Paul's letters, or at least some of them, and he's I mean, they're edited, but he has them. And so Luke, or whoever is writing Acts, clearly does as well, especially if it's an early 2nd century text. Paul is not an insignificant player in the early 2nd century. And so this author, I think, is creating a story where, I mean, they might be working from other source material, creating their story, but they are working from a constellation of source material of Paul's letters, maybe some type of travel journal of some sort, travel records of some sort. One of the things that's really interesting is if you take the journeys of Paul from Acts and you plot them out on a map, they actually make really good sense geographically. So the geography of Acts matches up really well with what we would expect from what we know about trade routes and those sorts of things. And so I think that there is a possibility of those kinds of primary documents. Now, in terms of the we passages, I have to come back to that because I don't have a good explanation for the we passages, but I don't think that this author, I don't think that they're editorial fatigue or copying fatigue.
Tell me.
Just because I think that these authors are, I think that these authors are collectors, and I think that they are highly literate, and I think that they are writing very intentionally. And I don't know, with the we passages being as attested as they are, I don't know if a very clear sort of copyist mistake or authorial mistake would persist, right? So I think there's something there, whether it is, well, this particular travel
But there is editorial fatigue in the synoptics when you compare them to Mark, right? There are mistakes that sort of have persisted. I'm trying to think of one off the top of my head. There's the feeding of the 5,000, right? In Mark, they're just way out in the desert and they say, oh, but we're in a deserted place. And then I forget if it's Luke or Matthew puts them in Bethsaida, and and he carries through the line about, oh, but we're in a deserted place. Whereas earlier in the text, it's he's created a narrative contradiction by bringing forward that language, just thoughtlessly copying over the language about we're in a deserted place. So in one passage he says they're in a busy fishing village, and then he says they're in a deserted place, and that's because he's just copying word for word from Mark.
Or that the author, and that might be, to play devil's advocate, that might be fatigue. It also might be evidence that the author doesn't know anything about the geography of the region.
Yes.
So that's a possibility, is to say, like, these authors, a lot of times we, I think, overestimate how much these authors knew about the region that they're talking about, and some certainly might, but it also may be the case that this author has no idea.
Yeah, I don't think we have to picture these as Israelites living like in the land that they're talking about. Yeah. Anyway, I this is a pet theory, and like I merely say I think that there are mistakes there, and it wouldn't be wild to me if that's what we're looking at in Acts, but I don't know. I'm not like wedded to that.
I have not done this work, but this conversation is making me think that it might be interesting to see if you're looking at the Greek of where the we passages, because my argument for them being some sort of meaningful part of the story that the author is telling is that they aren't just one oops. They tend to be sustained. And I would wonder, so first of all, this author clearly knows the difference between the first person plural and the third person plural. But also, I would wonder if you look at the Greek and see, my guess, and again, I need to actually go do this work, but my guess is that it actually would take more effort to write out the first person plural than it would take to write out the third person plural, in sort of we did versus they did. So I don't have an airtight theory on what what the we passages are doing there. My best one is sort of maybe they are sort of there to give the reader a sense of presence among the, I don't know. They're still a little bit of a mystery to me.
Yeah, and like just a lot of this stuff you might not have hard answers on. Right. So okay, that's a good look. That's a good dive through the 2nd century. Yeah. By the 2nd century, you already have a sense, though, of like not canon, but maybe like we know these are old and we like them and we trust them, sort of thing.
Yep.
So a good example of that is when Marcion does his gospel. Everyone's like, nope, that's just a copied version of Luke. No. Then they spot it immediately and call him out on it. And there's people who've argued now that maybe Marcion was earlier. We needn't get into that. But you've already got a sense of like, they're beginning to think in terms of tiers of texts.
Yes.
Where does that come from, and how do we get from there to like people starting to shop around lists of like, once you get into the 3rd century and the 4th, people are like, maybe it's like these ones, and they differ and we eventually settle. But how does that progression look like?
Yeah. Well, and so and of course in the 4th century you have the kind of the thing that everyone points to, Athanasius's Festal letter of 367, I think, which has the kind of canonical.
You say list. As if I would have any clue about. No, it was 368 or something. But
I'm just going to start throwing out, pseudo Hezekiah in the year 492. No, so Athanasius in the 4th century, I think I'm fairly certain it's 367. Yeah. His letter sort of specifies here's the list. These are the accepted texts, but he also includes a couple of other ones that are good for personal reading, but don't read them in public. I think the Shepherd of Hermas is on there as well. So anyway, but how do we get from like these are all texts that are kind of playing on the same playground, and how do we get from that to, you know, in the 4th century you have somebody who's saying these are the ones that you should be reading. So so yes, by the in the 2nd century, already by the late 2nd century, you have a sense that there are texts that are more, I don't want to say more accurate because that's not helpful, but you have certain texts that are more, that have more authority. And I think you do get this in the 2nd century, this sort of elevated Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the 2nd century. They are different for some readers. They are, however we want to say, more authoritative, more important. They're up on a little bit of a higher pedestal. And you already see that with the way that these apocryphal texts are dealing with them. So there's a lot of different theories that come in on how this process of canonization works. At the end of the day, we really don't have good records on any of this stuff. We do know that it wasn't just a group of dudes who got into a room and said, this is what people will read, and this is all that people will read. That's a very common misconception. It pops up with, you know, discussions of Nicaea and those sorts of things, like, oh, at Nicaea they decided what the Bible was. No, they really didn't. But what did happen is a much more kind of grassroots organic movement. So why do we have more copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John than we have of other, or why do we even have these things when we don't have the other gospels? Well, the short answer to that is that people were reading them, and people were copying them, and people were recopying them and distributing them and hire, you know, so if you wanted to know something about Jesus and somebody's like, oh, you know what you should read Mark or whatever. Well, you then go find somebody who has Mark and you hire somebody to copy it, whatever. So the process of literary production is what ultimately decides what texts are the ones that are included in the canon. It's like if we think about this in terms of a crowdsourced anthology, right? Of an anthology of, I mean, in my context, what I use when I talk about this in my classes is I tell my students to come up with a list of 20th century American literature. Like, what's going to be on that list? You know, you're going to have Vonnegut, you're going to have other American authors, right? You're not going to include anything that I wrote in middle school. Like I wrote a, you know, I mentioned Kurt Vonnegut a second ago. I wrote a, not long, but a fun little fan fiction of Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle and the Bokonon character who's in Cat's Cradle. I don't know where it all is now, but it's probably never going to see the light of day because nobody's read it. Like I've read it, a friend of mine read it, and a teacher of mine read it, and then didn't comment on it. We won't go there, but right. But an anthology of literature from a time period, if you're putting together an anthology, you're going to pick texts that people have actually read. It doesn't make any sense to include texts that were just not read by anyone. And so Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as well as the letters of Paul that we have, as well as the other materials, these things were being used, and they were being used because people liked them and because they sort of meshed well with people's theology, right? When people wanted to read a book about Jesus, they wanted the book to confirm what they already believed about Jesus, right? That's how a lot of people pick stuff to read to begin with. But then there's that cyclical effect of you choose the things that conform with what is already in your head, and then by reading those things that conform to what's already in your head, it then reinforces that these are the things you should be reading. So when I talk about canon, again, ultimately, I throw my hands up and go, it's pretty mysterious. But I think about it more in terms of, by the 4th century, when Athanasius is making his list, nothing on that list is surprising anyone. You know, like he's not throwing it like, oh, Hebrews, what's this? Like, no, he's choosing texts. He's putting texts there on that list that are already acknowledged as like, these are the texts that everyone reads, I think.
Yeah. I think that you sort of mentioned there's almost like a kind of conspiracy theory about
Yes.
I think the motivation for that, I mean, the motivation to have the Gospels earlier in Eyewitness, which we talked about a lot, that's the motivation to want them to be accurate, right? I think the motivation for the there were like books that were censored out of the Bible is an opposition among, let's say, more secular, more left-wing people today to what they see as oppressive or conservative aspects of organized religion, and a desire to say, which in some cases I may well be quite sympathetic to, but a desire to say, you got it wrong, and actually you've been tricked, and this real guy, Jesus, he was actually kind of like a progressive liberal socialist, but the church fathers or Paul or whoever you want to say, they conspired. But, I've seen through it all. And actually, if you dig underneath that, it was either all made up or actually Jesus was a liberal just like me. And there's a sort of ideological project undergirding that. So the goals, some of which is goals I'm sympathetic to, but it's not good history.
No, it's not good history. And it's, this sort of here, I mean, we look at something like the Gospel of Jesus's Wife papyrus that came out quite a while ago now, and is a forgery, right? But why were people so excited about this? It was like, well, this is, proof that Jesus was married. I mean, first of all, even if it was real, that isn't what it is. And right, it's if it's an authentic, if it's
no, that's right. It's just
like if the Gospel of Jesus's Wife was an authentic papyrus, which again it isn't, but if it was authentic, what can you say from that? Well, what you can say is the author of this papyrus clearly believed that Jesus had a wife. That's all you can say. And then you can sort of say, you can make claims, you can make hypotheses based on that. But yeah, I do think you're right in describing this as kind of a conspiracy theory. There's very much, it's the same kind of conspiracy theory. I get asked this by well-meaning people all the time when I talk at churches and stuff, and they'll say, wouldn't you love to, get into the Vatican library and really see what's there? Like, sure. I mean, it's not a secret. It's all online, and you can get in. Yeah. All you have to do is ask for a pass. Like,
people who are convinced that the Dead Sea Scrolls have been banned and you can't access the real texts and stuff. Yeah. There's an online thing if you can read the language.
Yeah, it's like, wouldn't you love to see the stuff that was outside the Bible that has all been censored? Like, well, I mean, I have one of my shelves back there is filled with I mean, this material is out there. All of it's been translated.
It's kind of a conflation of two things, I think. One of which is religion can be a tool to control people for oppressive means. Sure. Yes. The other of which is religion was or this religion at least, was self-consciously designed as such. And the nice people were censored out. And it's it's not as organized or intentional as that. Certainly not back in the ancient period. Yeah.
Certainly, or today, right? I mean, the whole the conspiracy theory that the Vatican's the convenient bugaboo for everyone, but they're hiding all of this. The true Christianity is all being hidden, whatever. That's not true, right? Well, why isn't I get this question a lot. Why isn't the Gospel of Thomas in the New Testament? Well, number one, apparently not as many people were reading it because we just don't have the copies of it, and also number two, it's pretty weird. There's the part at the end about Jesus saying, he's going to make there's the part at the end where Jesus says that, or Peter rather says, Mary needs to leave. She's a woman. She's not worthy of life. And then Jesus is like, don't worry. I'm going to make her a man so she can be in the kingdom of heaven with the rest of us men. And people who ask me, why isn't the Gospel of Thomas in the New Testament? They haven't really bothered to read to the end of it yet. The reason that this was not a self-selecting text for early Christianity is because it didn't it didn't resonate in the same way with that kind of amorphous majority, right? And again, it's a mistake to say like there was like the majority and then there were all these other fringe groups. Everyone's kind of doing their own thing, but there is kind of a gradual coalescing that happens, and the Gospel of Thomas isn't part of that because it's just
one other thing I'd say to this, and you've been very, very generous with your time, so I shan't, but is if people say, oh, the Bible was put together as like part of a conscious conspiracy to promote what Orthodox Christianity and censor everything else and have like one official version of events that was all well, they didn't do a very good job, did they?
No,
because the New Testament differs wildly on all sorts of stuff. And a lot of what we think about as Orthodox Christianity is post-biblical developments. And a lot of I think what people are motivated to complain about is like conservative evangelical Christianity. A lot of that is post-biblical. Like, the Trinity isn't really in the New Testament. There's nothing obviously that speaks to abortion. There's a few stray sentences on homosexuality, but a lot of what is Christian is stuff that's come up through church history and a lot of it's fairly modern, like it's not come what you object to in Christianity, again, much of which I will agree with you on, doesn't come from the Council of Nicaea,
Right. Yeah, and I know I think that's absolutely right. And I do think that it's it is a I think a lot of the conspiracy theories either comes from folks who are either just sort of secular or atheist or however you want to describe that, agnostic, but sort of have a very, very poor understanding of history and also a desire to kind of really show that like the church, I use that term loosely, Christianity as a whole, whatever you want to call it, is sort of corrupted and and it's all BS, right? That's the kind. Well, if that is actually the reality, right? The historical reality. Well, first of all, like what you said, nobody who is really thinking through these things is putting together the New Testament as like the perfectly coherent collection of scripture. The New Testament is as coherent as the Hebrew Bible, right? These are and the goal of these texts is not to be. They don't need to be ideologically coherent for them to accomplish what they need to accomplish. But you're right. On the one hand, if they were going to sit there and put together a collection that was going to be the kind of end all be all and excluding all of these other voices, they did a horrible job. But
same
they
with the
also
Old Testament. Like if you want a religion where there's a holy book that all says one thing coherently, and this might not be the Bible for you,
Yeah. Well, but the other thing they did a horrible job with, though, and this is where I just sort of I throw up my hands in a different way. The stories about this being sort of a orchestrated conspiracy that happens in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries or whatever. The evidence that we have obliterates that story. And so that's where I really encourage people who are talking about, these conspiracy theories behind canonization and stuff, go and read some books. Like go and read books by not only Christian scholars, because there are plenty of Christian New Testament scholars out there. You might be worried that they're biased. Fine. Go find any of the hundreds of books that were written by people who don't have those faith commitments, good historians. And that narrative just falls to pieces, and it falls to pieces really easily. And so, it's a very, very common story that just also happens to be entirely false.
Yeah, no, I agree, and it just, I think it's attractive. But anyway, we should wrap. Let me give you a plug to end with, because in all of that, we did not touch your latest book, The Magi. So I will plug that for you. You have just written a book on the wise men, magicians, or whatever, who appear in Matthew and then get built out in the proto-gospel of James and so on. which I have just read and neglected to mention in this conversation. It is beautifully written, very accessible, and anyone can pick that up. So I recommend people have a look at that. Is there anywhere else you would like to direct listeners to go to? A website, Twitter handle, anything like that?
I technically still exist on Twitter if you want to if you want to follow me there. I don't post a whole lot on Twitter really at all anymore, but I'm more active on Blue Sky, and so I would encourage you to check that out as a nice Twitter alternative. But yeah, thank you for the shout out for the Magi book. That was a lot of fun. I've got another book, a co-edited volume coming out in the spring on Judeophobia, so anti-Judaism and the ways that the New Testament and its interpretations have fueled that. But yeah, you can find me on really you can just find me anywhere. I'm kind of all over the place. So
I'll follow you on Blue Sky if I don't already, because I'm trying to get set up there too.
Yeah, I found it to be a really nice platform. So.
I've liked it so far, to be fair.
Yeah.
Listen, Eric, I so appreciate that, and you were generous with your time, and I learned a lot, and I hope that's interesting for the audience. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.